This video is brought to you by SoundMoneyCampaign.com. Be part of the solution. Visit SoundMoneyCampaign.com today. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and back with us today is David Quintieri, the author of The Money GPS. David, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's my pleasure to be here. And I just want to note that, I was first on this show a long time ago when this was a much smaller audience, and now you've grown and so many more people are really interested in what we have to say. So this is really a celebration.
Well, thank you so much, David. And today I wanted to discuss that, the Federal Reserve has been the lender of last resort and has helped bail out many banks in the past. But some people are asking, could the lender of last resort actually need a bailout itself soon? James D. Hamilton, an economist professor at UC San Diego, said recently, quote, "If you buy bonds and interest rates go up, you're going to take a capital loss on those bonds. The more the Federal Reserve buys, the bigger their balance sheet, the bigger the loss they're going to face." And Representative Mick Mulvaney recently stated also that, quote, "The Federal Reserve stands to lose a lot of money. And by a lot of money, I mean hundreds of billions of dollars. It is not hyperbole to suggest that the next big bailout could be of the Federal Reserve." So, David, what are your thoughts on people thinking that the Fed will need a bailout? Do you see that the Fed will need a bailout in the future sometime soon?
Of course, in a way, it does need to be bailed out right now. And the fact is that the Federal Reserve creates their money out of thin air. Everyone listening to this knows that. So we need to look at the statistics. First of all, the Fed's balance sheet is nearing $4 trillion. That is an extremely large number, one which would crush the taxpayer. But then the question we have to ask is that $4 trillion the only money they've printed? And of course, we know with the GAO audit that there has been much more than 4 trillion printed. They found 16 trillion, and that was a very limited audit. It only audited very specific portions of the Fed during a specific time frame. So the amount that they've printed is at least in the tens of trillions. So if they were to put that onto the back of the taxpayer, it would absolutely crush them for as far as the eye can see. Inflation rates wouldn't be able to be stopped because the Fed wouldn't be able to print enough money to keep those inflation rates down.
That's a really interesting point. And when I read this article that included those quotes, it was from the LA Times, and I was a little confused about it because I don't really understand who would care if the Federal Reserve's balance sheet loses some money. Who actually owns the assets that the Federal Reserve has, and who would be affected by, those assets losing value? I don't really understand why the Fed would even require a bailout. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, who cares if the Fed loses money?
Well, the Fed is, every time it prints a dollar, it goes deeper into debt. But who is ultimately going to pay that bill? It is the American taxpayer, indirectly, of course. So to branch off onto that, this has to be intentionally designed. There's no way that they can push the economy so far down to destroy it like they're doing, with unemployment being so high, poverty being so high, and their only solution is to print more money and give it to banks. This makes no sense at all if you're coming from an honest man's view. But if you really look into this and realize that every time the Fed prints a dollar, a banker gets rich. That's what's going on here. The bankers are using the Federal Reserve as their own personal printing press.
So I see how, if the dollar lost value, then American people would lose out a lot. But I don't see how the Federal Reserve assets, a lot of those assets are U.S. bonds. If interest rates rise, then the value of those bonds go down. But why would the American people care about the value of U.S. bonds falling?
Ultimately, whenever there is something unsure, or they are distraught, or they're worried, or any sort of thing like this, consumer confidence, for example, they're all interconnected. So you want, as a citizen, you want basically everything to be doing well. And the more of these indicators that come out, it starts to affect other things. Everything's all interconnected. All countries are all interconnected through globalism. So it's really not easily identified and pinpointed, but essentially, at least on the outside, they want everything to be doing well. That's why they keep things off the books. Like, for example, with the if you use generally accepted accounting principles like the shadowstats.com John Williams, he finds out that the actual deficit of the US is nearly 100 trillion. So it looks okay and reasonably bad at 17 trillion, but then when you actually calculate it using a proper method, it's nearly 100 trillion. So they play these tricks on the citizens, and it allows them to basically not have to worry right now because the real numbers are hidden.
Right, and I mean, mentioning that if the value of bonds go down, that isn't very good for consumer confidence, and the Federal Reserve is trying to prop up the value of bonds by just printing more and more money and buying a bunch of bonds. And Ben Bernanke recently has stated that, quote, this is going to end up being a profitable policy for the American taxpayer. But you wouldn't agree that quantitative easing, printing all this money, will actually be profitable for the American taxpayer, do you?
Absolutely not. It hasn't been since the introduction of the Federal Reserve. So why all of a sudden is that going to change? And the answer is that, of course, it's not. They play these games on people and just reassuring them consistently at the same time that they're stealing their wealth. That's exactly what this is. And in fact, this question reminds me of something I just read recently. A Fed official came out and essentially apologized. I believe he's a former Fed official, but he came out and basically apologized, saying that he thought QE would work, but he realizes that this is a policy that is destroying the dollar rather than propping up the economy. It did not work the way that he thought it could have worked. And yet they're still pursuing that policy.
Exactly, and I believe I actually saw the quote from Andrew Huszar, I believe it was, who was the former Fed official, and he was saying that he was responsible for executing the centerpiece program for the Fed's first plunge into the bond buying experiment known as quantitative easing. He said that the central bank continues to spin quantitative easing as if it is helping the American people, Main Street, but all it's really doing is it's a backdoor bailout for Wall Street.
That's exactly what it is. This is something that we've been talking about for so long. Anyone who knows what really is happening knows that that is exactly what this is. If they really wanted to, and I've made the suggestion many times before, if they really wanted to help the American citizen, and I do not recommend this, they would take the money that they had for these bailouts of the banks and they would give a check to every citizen. If they really wanted to help the citizens, they would just cut them a check. But instead, what do? They prop up the banks. So this right there just shows you how fake this is, and yet it's still getting into people's heads. They think with their Obama phones and their free healthcare, quote unquote free healthcare, that they're getting something for free and their government is helping them. But unfortunately, the government has been overtaken by an elite squad of people that are ultimately making the decisions. They're pulling the strings, and we are at the other end taking the worst possible scenarios that we can imagine.
Right, and you mentioned, if the Federal Reserve really wanted to help people, then they just, give American people, a check for however much. And the problem there is they might think that would help the American people, but really, in the end, it would just cause prices to rise, and that extra check wouldn't really get the American people anywhere because they'd have to pay more and more for, the food and gas and all the other stuff American people have to purchase in their daily lives. So the check wouldn't really help at all. But instead, the Federal Reserve is basically propping up the bond market and also giving, I believe, $45 billion a month to buy mortgage-backed securities or toxic assets off of banks' balance sheets. So the American people are getting the inflation, but the banks are getting the money, basically.
That's exactly right. They're we are getting the short end of the stick and they're getting all the benefits. So these bankers who are basically trading this garbage paper around, they're getting all this benefit and we get nothing but the inflation. That's what we're left with. We're left with inflation, which is slowly and steadily rising, and the bankers are left with full pockets. And that's the way it's always been working. And this is especially notable since the introduction of the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. And I know Jim Rickards, who is a partner at Tangent Capital Partners, he said that QE will go down as one of the greatest economic blunders in history. Would you agree with that? Do you see that the QE will basically just cause, will be looked at as one of the worst things the Federal Reserve has ever done and basically possibly cause an economic collapse?
Yes, that is what's going to happen. That's undoubtable. What I would like to say is that QE3 really is much more dangerous than one or two, because QE3 allows this open-ended stream of garbage to flow in. So I never thought they would do this personally. I'm quite a bear at this time right now, and I never thought they would have just left the tap open. But they've done that. They've said we will print and print and print, and they are doing that. And 85 billion right now in total per month is simply not enough. That is not enough money to prop up the system. They're going to have to increase that. And I just talked about this recently, actually, where at Davos, the World Economic Forum there, they said that they needed $100 trillion of credit to prop up this system. That's the kind of numbers that I'm talking about. 85 billion is just child's play.
Do you see that the QE that the Federal Reserve is doing right now is having an impact currently? I know there are those who say, that QE is basically not causing inflation currently because it's just giving the banks a bunch of money, and that money is just sitting on banks' balance sheets. But then there are also those who say, we're seeing a lot of inflation right now. John Williams over at shadowstats.com is saying that if you calculate inflation the way they used to, then inflation is around about 10%. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see that we're seeing a lot of inflation because of QE currently, or do you see that inflation is low and we haven't seen the full effects of the inflation because the money is just sitting on banks' balance sheets?
Well, here's the thing. When you print money, you can't really decide what assets will rise. Personally, I go shopping all the time, and when I'm buying my food, I'm paying particular attention to how much I'm paying. And it is notable that for certain things, I'm paying at least 20% more than I was last year. And I'm in Canada, and we're only seeing sort of the ripple effect of what the Federal Reserve is doing. So prices for certain things are absolutely rising. This is no doubt here. But we also have seen the Dow Jones, the S&P, that has risen quite a bit from the lows on the S&P in March 2009, undeniably. But when you think about the tens of trillions that have been printed just to get the market to come back to life a little bit, and this is supported entirely by money printing. There's no real investment in there anymore. So I see that the inflation is going to take some time to really get in and really do damage. For the time being, it's not exactly really up to the really high levels that we will see in the future. That is undoubtable.
I know you recently reported that Venezuela's president actually enforced price controls recently. Do you see that when this price inflation really picks up, America could do the same thing?
They will absolutely do that. And they've done it before. So, I mean, this is just history repeating itself. The US will implement every single measure possible in order to stave off this inflation. However, they will only cause more inflation and will eventually it will hit a hyperinflationary scenario. That's a guarantee. They can't stop it now. It's too late. And the question is, what will happen during this hyperinflation? How will they be able to really control the system while it's collapsing? Because if you look in Venezuela, it's clearly it's not that bad because people are still, even at 54% inflation, the people are still lining up to buy garbage electronics with their money. Now, I understand when you hit a hyperinflation scenario, you want to buy something because your dollars are useless essentially. But I suggest people buying things that will hold value, like gold and silver. Let me just mention that. So, I mean, I talked about this in my book a lot. You want to buy things that are going to hold value. And you should do that prior to a hyperinflation. But if you're in the hyperinflation now, you should be scrambling to get anything that will hold value longer than those garbage dollars.
Right, I know that, in my opinion, holding gold and silver is an excellent idea right now, but I know we've talked about this a little bit before, that gold and silver haven't really performed that well in the past 2 years, and just today, gold and silver went down. Silver is actually under $21 currently. Why do you see with all this money printing that gold and silver have done so poorly?
Well, if you need to scare people off from buying gold and silver, you gotta push the price down. Everyone knows that the gold and silver markets are being manipulated. Physical gold and silver are what people are buying. The paper is what these companies, the hedge funds and whoever, are selling off. So they're selling off the ETFs, but what they're really doing is buying physical gold and silver. So while the paper market it might be hurting right now, the physical market is still in high demand. This is worldwide. People in India and other regions, they're purchasing physical gold near record levels. This is very high for even them who generally do buy a lot of gold and silver. So I have to say that don't be afraid to buy gold and silver and other things. I'm not just saying just gold and silver, but don't be afraid to buy them just because of the price, because the physical asset, the real bullion, is still worth a tremendous amount. And when the time comes, when the collapse officially tips, this is when gold and silver are going to spike dramatically in a very short period of time.
Right, and I know I recently talked with Alistair McLeod from goldmoney.com, who has over 40 years experience in the finance industry, and McLeod said that in order to protect from the demise of the dollar, as you're mentioning, Asia is buying a lot of gold. China is currently buying gold at the rate of 2,600 tons annually, which, by the way, is about more than the annual production of gold. And Germany a while ago asked for their gold back, and the Federal Reserve is like, it's going to take like 7 years. And Germany didn't even ask for all of its gold. I believe they asked for like 8% of it. And a lot of people don't see that, the Federal Reserve or the U.S. government actually has the gold they say they do. So if the, Asia, China, Russia, if they're all buying all the gold and the United States doesn't have much, where do you see the economic power being when people realize whoever has the gold has the power? Where do you see the power ending up?
Well, it's definitely not in the Western world because the West has got rid of their gold and they've gone to a completely credit-based system. But of course, countries like China are also printing money at very high rates as well. So they're not necessarily all in on gold and silver, but they are definitely diversifying out of the US dollar and are purchasing gold at record rates. That is undeniable. They have the foresight to see that, okay, 20, 30, 40 years from now, the US isn't going to be that superpower anymore. We want to take that crown, the BRIC nations there and other emerging economies as well. They see that decades from now, they're going to be the ones with the power. So they need to essentially look at the United States, look at their dollar and say, you know what, you're not going to be our future investment, so we need to slowly wean off of you. But this takes a long time. They have been doing so, but it does, take a long time for that to unfold.
Right. And so when investing, do you see that it would be best just to hold, as you're suggesting, hold precious metals to prepare for a collapse? Or do you see that because China and Russia and all those other countries have a bunch of gold, do you see them not being as impacted by an economic collapse in America, and that maybe investing some money in stocks over there would be a good idea? What is your opinion on this?
It's a little two-sided here, but basically, undoubtedly, you want to have your money in real assets. So you want it in gold and silver. Junk silver is great. You want it in some sort of real estate, despite real estate prices in certain areas. You want it in land. You want it in some sort of storable food. Some of your savings should be in some sort of preparation like storable food. You want to have basically something that retains its value in the worst times. That's undeniable. Gold and silver just happens to be historically the best. That's why I recommend it. Now, countries like China, for example, who are purchasing gold at record rates, who have tons of gold and will have tons of gold in the future, these countries will be less affected. However, their paper market is still much, much more gigantic than their assets in gold and silver. So while they may fare a bit better, they're still going to be destroyed by globalization. So when one country goes down, the dominoes will fall, and the whole world is going to be affected. Now, the climb out of that fall will be much quicker for the emerging markets.
Before we let you go, I recently just saw a video that you posted on your YouTube channel, which was really interesting. You were talking about how Obamacare has been a disaster, and that Obamacare all along, it seemed like you were saying, was not free healthcare as it was put out to be. The point of Obamacare was to control healthcare. Can you expand a little bit about that?
Absolutely. From day one, when they were talking about Obamacare and how it was going to be so loving and it was going to be free healthcare for every citizen and everyone's going to have their own doctor and all sorts of fantasy. I live in Canada. I know what socialist healthcare is. That means if you want an MRI, for example, because you need to get an operation, by the time you can get that MRI, the thing is already expired and you'll need to go back to the specialist and have them repeat this process over again in a never-ending cycle unless you can somehow talk to somebody who knows somebody to get you in sooner. The system is designed to ration care. That is exactly what a socialist healthcare plan is. Ration care, provide good, it might be good care as it is in Canada, it's good, but it's rationed, it's controlled. They only have one possible um, basically one possible allopathic medicine, Rockefeller medicine to give you. There is no alternative. They only have one suggestion. They only have one viewpoint. Everything is controlled. It's just like the education system. It's a failure and it doesn't work in the other countries. For example, like myself in Canada, I see it with my own eyes and now I'm seeing it in the US and it's going to be a big problem for every US citizen.
I recently discussed with Ann Barnhart about Obamacare. She believes that Obamacare all along was planned to fail and that the plan was for everyone then to be given Medicare. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's a possibility that that was the plan all along?
I don't have any insider information on that, but I could say that, that would mean more people under government control. And as I look deeper and deeper into this, I realize what the government is trying to do is trying to gain more control. Every single chance it can get, financial, healthcare, education, they're always trying to grab more control. And if they can provide, quote, free service to people, whether it's free education or free healthcare, they will use that opportunity. So this very well could be the case.
So with the government seeming to, just intrude more and more into our lives, in the United States, in where you live in Canada, all these countries all around the globe, wherever you live, it seems like most of the countries are, just expanding government and, taking away more and more of our liberties. What are some ways that we can stand up and, say, we're not going to have any of this?
The very first and most important way to fight against this is literally to speak up. That means using your freedom of speech. The US Constitution has the freedom of speech as the First Amendment there intentionally because that's the most important. You need to use your freedom of speech to keep it. So speak up to your friends, to your family, make YouTube videos, make a blog, write your person, your representative in government. I've done this before. You got to make phone calls to them as well. Let them know. If you just yell and complain to the wall, the wall's not going to say anything to you. You need to go and talk to everyone. Make people realize that, the failures of government, I don't want my rights taken away. Why do we have free speech zones? That's the most Orwellian thing I've ever heard of in my life. A free speech zone. Why would they do this other than to crush people's liberty? That's what they're doing. So we need to fight against that. People need to take their money out of the banking system other than for daily transactions. That is very important. So what do you do with your money? You got, 5,000, let's say. Well, you need to use your own best judgment. But I would say that gold, silver, junk silver, storable food, things that hold value over a longer term, not paper money. And when you pull money out of this system, you're hurting them twofold. You are using their fractional reserve banking system against them because now they have to leverage back a bit. And also you are simply using your money to buy a real asset that they don't control. So this is two very simple things that you can do today to make small changes which will multiply into big things.
All right, David Quintieri, thank you so much for joining us today. Did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and maybe tell them where they can find you?
Yes, absolutely. So if anyone wants to find me, the best place is themoneygps.com, or they can go to my YouTube channel, The Money GPS. And if they like my free book, which I give away on my site there and in any of my videos, they can then go to Amazon, buy it. I've got a lot of positive feedback so far, a very simple way for people to get into finance. And it really breaks down the system at its core. It's a very simple book using illustrations and graphs and charts, but yet it's jam-packed with historical data. So the one thing I want to leave people with is simply that we cannot be fooled by what is in the media. The government provides statistics that are completely fraudulent. So when we look at a $4 trillion balance sheet of the Fed, we need to realize it's really not $4 trillion. If they're admitting it's $4 trillion, it's going to be a lot larger than that. So this goes for everything. Do not believe what they're telling you. Look it up, do the research for yourself, and empower yourself to be better. And then help someone else do the same.
Once again, David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Go to financeandliberty.com and subscribe for free for more interviews and financial insight.